Now, if you're a regular viewer, you may remember that a while back I did a review of the first ever wargaming book that I bought, Terence Wise's excellent introduction to battle gaming. Of course, I bought a couple of other books since then. The next one I bought was really fueled by my interest in Second World War wargaming, which sort of branched out into making 1/35th scale models, mostly Tamiya at the time. Now, I was particularly interested, although not exclusively, in German armour. This led me to, a year or so after buying the battle gaming book, to buying what is still an excellent reference work, I think, to painting German armour. Today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at Panzer Colours. And here is that copy I bought probably about 1976, 1977. Yes, I've still got it. It's one of those books that has remained on the bookshelf. Panzer Colours, Camouflage of the German Panzer Forces 1939 to 1945 by Bruce Culver and Bill Murphy. Now, before we get into the book itself, I just want to say something, because I know that fairly recently there's been some talk prompted by a particular upload on YouTube about the perils, if you like, of wargaming World War II, or maybe even historical wargaming in general, in that if you're playing a two-sided game, a historical game in World War II, someone has to take the German side. So this, of course, led to some accusations, perhaps, and a lot of debate. So I just want to say, as someone who had and still has an interest in German armour and equipment of that period, in my experience, I've not met anyone in my entire time in gaming, which has been a fair old time. I've not met anyone who I could say was a Nazi sympathiser or anything close. In fact, I would say generally, overall, by far, the greatest majority of gamers I've ever met have been very inclusive people, and willing to accept anyone for what they are. And for me personally, I think the main interest in German armour, particularly the late war stuff, is twofold. One is the camouflage and paint schemes, which from a modelling perspective, let's face it, a lot more interesting. Most of your Allied stuff, your Shermans, your T-34s, your Cromwells, your Churchills, tend to be painted green, olive green, dark green, and variations thereof. So of course you can do stuff with weathering and everything else, but when we get into the German stuff, you can have anything from dark grey through to some elaborate three-colour camo schemes, as we'll see in a moment. And I think for me the second part of the fascination is just the quality of these machines. Now, I know that we can get into arguments about high tech versus lower tech, and things like your Panthers and your King Tigers were extremely intricate machines, particularly to run on a battlefield. And as the Russians found out, there's something to be said for simplicity, there's something to be said for being able to churn out tens of thousands of T-34s. Having said that, again, from I don't know if it's an aesthetic perspective, perhaps, there is something fascinating to me about these incredibly complex fighting machines. And as for that idea of, if you play this stuff in a war game, if you take the German side, then that is a sign of your political views. Well, again, as I've said before, I certainly don't think that. And I think, in fact, if anything, it gives you an appreciation of just the sheer bravery and guts of people like those Sherman and T-34 crew members who knew they were up against a tiger, they were up against something that could take them out from a huge distance away. So the bravery to know that and still press ahead anyway, I think is quite remarkable. So there's lots of different aspects to this question. Like most things, it's nuanced. It's not just a simple case of black and white. Having said that, it is a simple fact that these marvellous machines that you know, was so effective in many ways, not so much in others, and had these fantastic camouflage schemes, were built in factories by slave labour, people working under the absolute worst of conditions. So again, we have to factor that into any appreciation, if you like, or any time we look back at this particular period in history. Anyway, I just wanted to make that clear before we start. I'm sure most of you are well aware of that and cognizant of all of that anyway, but I think it's important every now and again just to mention these things. So, that being done, let's delve into the book. Panzer Colours then, hardback book, not very thick when you pick it up and look at it, but it does have 69 full colour plates and over 170 black and white photos. And as we mentioned, this is by Bruce Culver and Bill Murphy, illustrated by Don Greer. Now, Bruce Culver is actually a medical illustrator, but he had a big interest in AFVs. Was a very active member of the International Plastic Modeler Society in the USA. And I don't know if this was the first book that he ever did, but it certainly was one of the first. Since then, he's gone on to author a load of books, mostly on AFVs, particularly for Osprey. I think he's done a lot of work for Osprey. Bill Murphy, apologies to Bill Murphy, not being able to find anything out about him. The illustrator Don Greer is an American artist, and he's done illustrations for a ton of books, a huge amount of books. Again, a lot of books on AFVs and military and aviation history, but also fantasy and science fiction as well. This was published by Arms and Armour Press as part of Squadron Signal Publications, and first published in 1976. So that's about when I would have bought it, or maybe the year after. And straight away we've got a full-page illustration there, very striking. So, sources and acknowledgements. As you can imagine, especially at that time, getting hold of sort of wartime photos that hadn't already been seen took some amount of work. So a lot of thanks there to various people who contributed to the book. And then an introduction, really a little bit about what camouflage is. And we're straight into interior colours. And this is something that is interesting from a modelling perspective as well, because we tend to think of these elaborate colour schemes. We use airbrushes, we carefully paint our plastic kits. But here we have examples of people, well, using a spray gun here, but using a paintbrush, using what looks like a sort of broom or bison, and even here using some rags and everything. So it was a case of make do with what you got. From there we get a section on the effects of dust and weathering, and this is particularly pertinent to black and white photos, because these vehicles might look like they're very lightly coloured. In fact, they're painted dark grey, and this is the dust that gives them that appearance. So you can imagine there's a fair bit of work, again back then as well, sort of translating black and white into colour. We then get a brief overview of German camouflage pre-World War II, so 1918 to 34, and we're straight into the early war years. So the Phoney War, the invasion of Poland, and so on. Everything at this stage is pretty much dark grey, with some exceptions. I think here we've got a sort of dark green pattern over the dark grey. But for this period, you're pretty much covering everything in dark grey paint and then adding your dust and weathering on top. And I'm not sure how unusual or new these photos were at the time. They certainly weren't photos that I'd ever seen before. And there's a very extensive range in them, from AFVs and units actually in action to the things being painted and repaired and all that sort of stuff as well. So the full range of sort of operational practices, if you like. So then we're into Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, and at this stage everything is still pretty much dark grey, though now there's even more dust, there's certainly more mud, and another thing that we know for certain, there's going to be some snow. And yeah, here we are with that first winter of 1941, and of course the Germans seem to be totally unprepared for this. A lot of the units were still wearing summer uniforms. They thought the war would be over by now, Moscow would have fallen, but General Winter had other ideas. And we start to see the sort of improvisation that went on. So we have some crew here who actually have winter camouflage covers or uniforms, but the vehicle is covered with sheets. Other times then they just had to make do with very basic stuff. This vehicle has got lines of chalk drawn over it, and then we go on to things like whitewash, and eventually to some vehicles getting a whole covering, but it's still pretty much whitewash, which I can't imagine was very long lasting. The first sort of sign of rain, and that's pretty much gone. Winter is followed by spring, of course, and what that meant on the Russian front was all the snow melted, so you now got huge amounts of mud. And here now is where we start to see these more elaborate schemes coming in, with the appearance of dark green, or perhaps the reappearance, as we did mention that earlier. But now we start to see that used much more, but still over the dark grey, but we start getting what we might think of the classic German sort of wavy line or sprayed camouflage. We get into the next winter and things have improved a little bit in that they've actually got, I think, proper white paint now, not just the whitewash, and winter uniforms are being issued. So we start to see much better snow camouflage on vehicles. But again, this bottom picture here, we can still see the huge problems that mud must have caused. Must have made any sort of travelling very difficult. Now we go from cold Russia to North Africa, from the snow to the sun, and the Deutsche Afrika Korps. So this is where we start to get into the sort of more famous dark yellow colours, though initially, of course, everything is still grey. At this point in the book, we also get our first colour plate. These are scattered throughout. They're in sort of rather strange places. You get sort of one page and then you get a couple later on, which I guess at the time is something to do with the printing layout. You know, this is pre-digital printing, so colour plates had to be put in very specific places. But we start to get colour plates of some of those earlier AFVs we've seen. There's our dark grey with the green, and so on. And this is where we start to see that improvisation again. I guess you had dark grey vehicles on a very sort of light brown or yellow background. They must have stood out like a sore thumb. So crews started coating the vehicles in mud and so on. So a nice little set of pictures here of a crew doing exactly that. And then we can see the result with the dried mud on this half track here. Maybe this is what led to the adoption of the sort of yellow paint, the dark yellow colour schemes. There's our second set of plates, double page spread on the French and early Russian campaigns. Again, everything is still pretty much grey. And also a set of plates on the winter and spring of 1941 to 1942. There's our bed sheets, there's our chalk, and some of the more, well, shall we say, professional looking colour schemes there with the whitewash, and the first appearance of that green on grey. And we get our next colour plate, which starts showing those. So from grey to grey with mud to the yellow with green stripes. And here we get notice of that change. HM 1941, number 218, dated 17th of March 1941, directed that in place of the dark grey colour, all vehicles and equipment used by forces in Africa were to be painted in a base colour of yellow-brown with the grey-green used for mottling and camouflage patterns. Into Tunisia, and we start to see the appearance of our tigers and such like, and again another colour plate on there. So the sort of yellow colour, still bits of camouflage but not too much. And this is interesting, we start to see, I think pretty much so far, the first signs of foliage being attached to vehicles. Then we're back to the Russian front, 1943, so we're getting into Kursk and those kind of battles. And now we start to see the beginnings of the three colour camouflage. So everything is dark yellow again, but those additional colours now start to be applied. And again, we have the use of captured armour as well, T-34 in this case, big national insignia being put on the turret there, and the unit numbers also being painted on. And now we start getting into those classic colour schemes with the sprayed lines of brown or green over the base yellow coat. And we then go on to a section about Zimmerit. So as I'm sure you know, this is a sort of concrete or cement plaster put on the sides of vehicles in order to stop magnetic mines from sticking to them. There were a couple of different patterns of it. I think one was called waffle. There were two main patterns, I think. And now when you were modelling this back in the day, the only real way to do it was to put filler on your model, some sort of polyfiller or something like that, and then use the edge of something to make that particular pattern. Now, of course, models will come already Zimmerited up, or you can buy sheets of Zimmerit to actually apply. But over the Zimmerit, again, we start to see that classic sprayed line pattern. I think in this case it's red-brown over the yellow on the brum bar. This brings us into the final years of the war, and despite all the advances in camo and everything else, you know, sometimes foliage and a bit of tarpaulin was still the best thing to use. We can see how our winter camouflage has come along. It's a tiger with a solid coat of white paint on it, so very different from our earlier whitewash stuff. And now we get our next lot of colour plates on the Russian campaign. So again, from the grey through to the first appearance of those sprayed camouflage schemes. We also get some schemes from the Italian campaign as well. Monte Cassino there. Again, that's an interesting sort of, looks like sort of painted on colour. And then we've got another sprayed one from Russia. And then interesting ones like this, which is the red-brown, but with a sort of green edging to it, something a little bit different. And this is something that's mentioned in the book, was although we had these official paints and everything else, there seemed to be no official way to apply them, because we see such a variation. And possibly my most favourite of all camo scheme is this one. So this is a Stug 3 photographed during the Kursk offensive, and the caption is, Picasso obviously had an admirer in this crew. That's quite remarkable, really. And the final colour plate features what is my favourite camouflage scheme, 3 colour, but what is known as the ambush scheme, with these sort of dappled dots, which, you know, when they're under cover of woods or something like that, that sunlight coming through the leaves, this scheme really blends in, even for something as huge as the King Tiger. And as part of that as well, of course we're at the end of the war, and in Europe especially, the Germans had lost control of the air, so foliage became increasingly important, particularly in the Normandy campaign, but in Italy as well. So there's a Hummel in Rome, and we have a Stug 3 in a French village there that also has scalloped skirts as well. That's not easy to say, scalloped skirts, something quite unusual. Again, we just see the huge amount of variety in not only the colour schemes, but the vehicles themselves as well. And that foliage became increasingly important as German forces are on the defensive, so they're more inclined to be setting up ambushes. So we've got a Tiger one there, virtually invisible under the foliage, and just over the page here we have a panther that's in Italy, sort of concealed in a house. Again, a nasty surprise for anyone coming round the corner there, I should think. A couple of last pages of Normandy mostly, that classic Tiger one-shot with that classic camo scheme, the Panzer IV as well, and again just a little bit more on foliage fixed to various vehicles there. So that's pretty much it. We just get a little bit more detail about the ambush scheme used at the very end of the war, and quite a nice pic there of a Sherman Firefly pressed into German service. Again, very prominent crosses on the side. And it's interesting that how the end here, I guess supplies and everything were in short demand. So we've almost gone full circle. We've gone back to smearing mud over the vehicle as the primary form of camouflage. And there we are, that's it. We end up with a King Tiger in Hungary and a huge vehicle dump. There must have been loads of these at the end of the war. I imagine all that stuff was just cut up for scrap. But can you imagine finding any of that nowadays? I know things are still found. I think recently it was a panther was pulled out of a lake somewhere. So you just wonder if there's any of this stuff still left out there, sort of hidden away. Very well camouflaged, perhaps. There we go, that's Panzer Colours then. For me, at the time, that was an invaluable reference. As I said, pre-internet days, very difficult to get hold of much information at all outside of a few library books. And I think this was amongst the first of this type of book. Now, of course, there's hundreds of books that do similar things, and we've got the internet. It's very easy to find out colour schemes of particular units in particular places, almost down to the day, thanks to the research that a lot of historians have done. But still, I think it's an excellent reference guide still. I think they did another 2 volumes. Perhaps someone out there can let me know. I think there was a Panzer Colours 2 and 3. So at some time I'll be interested to have a look at those. I don't know why I never did in the past, but I shall search those out. I'm pretty sure this is still available. It's been reprinted many times, I should imagine. Or of course you can pick up these first editions. I'm not sure what sort of price they go for at the moment, but it's not a difficult book to get hold of. That's another favourite book from my library then. I've got plenty more to go. I've got hundreds of books in the house. I'm not going to go through all of them. I simply haven't got the time, but I will, over the course of the coming months, pick out a few others and talk about those as well. And I'll be interested to hear what your favourite books are, new or old. If there's anything you think I should particularly take a look at and review, then please do let me know as well. As always, keep your suggestions and questions and comments coming in. They're all very much appreciated. And please do like, share and subscribe to the channel. It really does help. I'll see you next time.